Mesh painting should feel intuitive and flexible, and it should actually work with Nanite meshes in the level. To achieve that, a material should give you full control over the process. That's what you get with the mesh paint material I've made. And in this video, I'll show you exactly how to use it to make better assets and environments. So let's do it. A quick review of the material features. Paint directly on Nanite meshes in the level using Unreal Engine 5.5's new texture painting feature. Depending on our need, we can use either vertex painting or texture painting. In Unreal Engine 5.4 and above, the material is fully set up for Nanite tessellation and displacement. Have up to 4 materials or 3 materials and puddle. Blend the different materials using mesh painting and height data. The puddle feature adds dynamic realism with ripple control, dirtiness, and height masking. Use custom masks to create overlays. The material supports both ORDP and ORM textures. Quickly adjust scaling and offset for each material. Use tri-planar projection so even meshes without UVs can be textured. User-friendly parameter groups and organization in the material instance. Easily fine-tune different look depth properties for each material using various parameters from the material instance. Add weathering effects or use a custom height texture to break tiling repetitions and add variations. The project includes an example level with ready-to-use materials to get you started. And finally, if you have any questions, you can have direct access to me via Discord or Telegram. You no longer need to build a complex material from scratch. No matter what project you're working on, this material will save you a lot of time. You can grab it from the link in the description. The download files. There are 3 zip files and each of them contains an Unreal Engine project. The first part of the name is the last date I've updated the asset, and the last part is the Unreal Engine version of the project file. One is made using Unreal Engine 5, one is made using Unreal Engine 5.4, and the other one is made using Unreal Engine 5.5. So no matter what Unreal Engine 5 version you're using, you're covered, now and in the future. The 5 and 5.4 versions only have vertex painting set up. The only difference between them is that the 5.4 version has Nanite tessellation and displacement. The 5.5 version has both vertex painting and texture painting set up within one material, and we can switch between them depending on what we need. This project can be used with all Unreal Engine 5 versions. This project can be used with Unreal Engine 5.4 and above, and this project can be used with Unreal Engine 5.5 and above. Now I'm gonna use the 5.4 version to showcase vertex painting and the 5.5 version to showcase texture painting. If you're using Unreal Engine 5.4 or above, my recommendation is to use the 5.5 version. It has all the features in one setup. So let's create a new folder and I'm gonna name it Mesh Paint 5.4. Move this project inside it, extract here, and let's open it. The project. When the project opens, by default the level I've provided for the assets is open. These are some material instances I've made while testing the features of the material. Now let's first navigate the content browser. In the HOD folder there are 4 folders. In Marketplace, Mesh Paint Material, you can find the maps and the material instances. In Materials, Masters, you can find the master material and some functions and default textures. In the Meshes folder, there are some meshes to test the material on, and in Textures, Polyhaven, I'll use them to explain how the material works. Mesh paint material and vertex painting. And now let's actually start working with the material. If you're using your own project, from up here click on settings, go to plugins, here search for mesh painting and make sure it is enabled. So now let's go to materials, masters, right click on the master material and create a material instance. I'm gonna name it mi_mesh paint material _ video. Save it and let's move it to the folder we want. In the level, select all these meshes and move them to the side. From the meshes folder, let's bring in this plane, the high polygon. Move it to the center of the board and let's move it up a little bit. Now if I set the view mode from here to wireframe, we can see that it's got a lot of vertices. That's what we need to get good result when vertex painting. So let's go back to the lit view mode. I'm also gonna add a mannequin to the level as the scale reference. So here click on add feature or content pack. Under blueprint, let's select the third person and add to project. Close it. Now open the characters folder, mannequins, meshes, and let's bring in mani simple. Save the level. Let's also rotate it like this. Okay. Let's go back to our material folder and assign the new material to the plane. Open the material instance and let's reorganize them like this. I've made the material instances UI as user-friendly as possible. There are 6 parameter groups. Let's start with global. In the 5.4 and the 5 version, there's only the puddle option here. But if you're using the 5.5 version, there's another option as well. It controls whether we want to use vertex painting or texture painting. We'll get to it in the texture painting section of the video. The puddle option is to control whether we want puddle in our material or not. By default, we have 4 materials. The first one is the base, and the other 3 can be painted using the R, the G, and the B channels when mesh painting. Now, if I enable the puddle option, we're gonna have 3 materials and puddle. So the B channel when mesh painting becomes the puddle. I'll go over how it works later in the video. It has its own section. For now, let's disable it and continue. Next, we have the height blend parameters. They can help us refine the look when blending these different materials. We'll come back to them after actually adding the materials and when we want to blend them. So let's open Mat 1 base and enable all its parameters. The first parameter controls whether we want to have tri-planar projection for this specific channel of the material. The texture size and offset parameters control the UV. This parameter is to control which type of mask texture we're using. Previously, when downloading Quixel materials from the bridge, the mask texture was ORDP. It contained the ambient occlusion, roughness, and displacement textures. But now when downloading them from the Fab plugin, the mask texture is ORM, ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic textures. We may have some materials from before and some newly downloaded materials from Fab. We can switch between them using this option. When it's enabled, the material uses ORM, and when it's disabled, the material uses ORDP. By default, it is enabled. That's why we have the ORM texture input here and another input for the displacement or height texture. Now, if I disable it, we'll get a metallic texture input and an ORDP texture input. So depending on your texture set, enable or disable this option. I have ORM textures, so I'm gonna enable it. We can enable these two options if we have a specular texture and an SSS texture or subsurface scattering texture. If I enable a specular, we'll get a specular texture input, and if I enable SSS texture, we'll get an SSS texture input and another parameter to control the subsurface color. It can be useful when adding materials like a snow. I'm gonna add a snow later in the video. So now let's browse to textures, Polyhaven, and I'm gonna use the cobblestone as the base material. So open the folder and let's start assigning the textures. This one is the mask texture, this one is the base color, the displacement, and the normal. We can't see the displacement right now. That's because we haven't enabled Nanite on this mesh. As a general rule, know that we can't vertex paint on Nanite mesh instances in the level. But there's a workaround with some limitations to have vertex paint on a Nanite mesh. Also in the 5.5 version and above, there's a new texture painting feature that can be used with Nanite mesh instances as well. I'll show you how both of them work later in the video. But for now, we're gonna continue with this non-Nanite mesh to go over how the vertex painting feature of the material works. So right now the texture is too large. Let's bring down the texture size to something like 0.1. That's better. And this is how the offset parameters work. Down here we have all the parameters we need to control how the material looks. Base color, tint, saturation, brightness, and contrast. We can use these parameters to control the roughness. This parameter controls the normal strength. Let's set it to 3 for example, or 0, 1 is fine. And these two parameters control the displacement. Then we have the height texture parameters. By default, the displacement texture is used to control how the different materials blend into each other based on height data. But we have the option to use a custom height texture to control how they blend. I'll come back to this option after we add the other materials. These two parameters control the height texture that's used to blend the material. The displacement parameters control how the displacement looks, and these height texture parameters control how the materials blend. Actually, let's enable Nanite on the mesh. Press Ctrl B to find it and let's enable it. As you can see, we can now see the displacement. We can use the displacement multiplier to increase or decrease the displacement. So for example, if I set it to 1.5, it becomes more, or 2. And if I decrease it to something like 0.5, it decreases it. Let's set it to 1. And we can use the displacement offset parameter to move the whole material up or down. So by default it's 0. If I increase it, it comes up, and if I decrease it, it goes down. And these shadow areas are caused by virtual shadow maps. If I look away and look again, they go away. So let's reset this one, disable Nanite, and continue. Next, there's the weathering option. This lets you add variation using noise. It's really useful for breaking repetition on large surfaces. Let's enable it to see how it works. As soon as we enable it, some new parameters appear and the color overlay is added on the surface. Enable all these new parameters. If we set the weathering amount to 0, we don't see any weathering, and if we set it to 1, the whole surface will be affected by it. Let's set it back to 0.6. We can also change the weathering color and its amount. The rest of these parameters can help us fine-tune how the weathering is added on top of the material. It uses a height texture to do that. By default, it's a gray color texture, but we can change it. For example, to the Perlin noise. Here it is. Let's set the weathering amount to 0.4, its height texture size to 0.6, its height texture multiplier to 1.8, and let's increase the contrast to 1.5. Now let's set the weathering color to something like this dark brown color, and we can decrease the color amount value to make it more subtle. 0.45 is fine. Let's change the weathering amount to see how it looks. For example, this is 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 and 1. I'm gonna go with 0.45. When we increase the height multiplier and contrast more than 1, weathering amount of 0 doesn't mean it is 0. So when it's 0, we have still some weathering, but if we reset these to 1, we don't have any weathering. So increasing these affects the weathering amount too. Be careful when using them. If we increase them too much, even when weathering amount is set to 0, we can clearly see the weathering effect. Something like 1.5 or 1.8 is fine. Let's set it to 1.5 and set this one to 0.45. That's good. So that's enough for material 1. Let's add material 2. Enable all these parameters. I'm gonna use the forest ground textures for this one. So let's browse to them. Here they are. And let's add it. Now we can go over both how to vertex paint this new material and how height blending works. First, let's set its size to 0.08 and let's increase the height texture multiplier to 3, 4, 5 and 6. As you can see, the material starts surfacing. The repetition is obvious though. That's because we're using height textures to blend them, and textures can become repetitive over large surfaces. So for this one, let's enable custom height texture and enable the newly added parameters. I'm gonna set it to the Perlin noise, and it already looks a little bit better. Now we can decrease the height texture multiplier to 5 or 4. That's much better now. If we set custom height texture amount to 0, the material will revert back to using the displacement texture as the height texture. It's like disabling custom height texture. Let's set this one to 5 to see the material. And if we set it to 5.5, we can see it better. So when we set the custom height texture amount to 1, we're using the Perlin noise, and when we set it to 0, now we're using the displacement texture. But the good thing is that we can change it to a value between 0 and 1 to use both the displacement texture and the custom height texture at the same time. If I set it to 0 and then slowly increase it, we can see the effect. Now again, we can use these parameters to control the size and the offset of the texture, and this parameter to control its contrast. Let's set it to 1 and go over how to vertex paint. So let's bring it here. From up here, click on selection mode and select mesh paint mode. Now under colors, click on paint to see the paint parameters. Now as we can see in the material instance, material 2 is connected to the red channel. So down here we only need the red channel. The other thing we should do is to swap the paint and the erase color, and we can do that by clicking here. So the paint color should be black and the erase color should be white. Now set up your brush settings from up here and let's start painting on the mesh. Now first of all, if you can't see the brush on the mesh, make sure to select the mesh first. So click on select here, select the mesh, and then click on paint. And now we can see the brush. So now we can paint the forest ground. And we can hold shift while painting to erase it. Let's decrease the strength to something like 0.2 to better see it. And as you can see, it's being added based on the height texture. So yeah. We can see it better if we go ahead and under material 1, increase the height texture multiplier to not the weathering height texture multiplier, the height texture multiplier of the material. Let's set it to 2 or 3 or 2.5. Yeah. Now we can see it better. We are painting it, but it's being blended based on the height data. We can then use the height texture parameters to better control how these two materials are blended. For example, under material 2, let's set the height texture contrast to 1.5 and let's set the custom height texture amount to 0 or set it to 0.7 and let's set its size to 0.5. Yeah. And if when painting, let's select the mesh, select paint and start painting. Now if you see these type of repetitive patterns, we can simply remove them. So let's go back to mesh painting, decrease the size of the brush, increase the strength and let's set it to 0.1. Hold shift while painting to remove them. Yeah, that's it. For the third material, I want to add snow. So let's enable all the parameters. And browse to the textures and start assigning them. So this one is the mask texture, base color, normal, and displacement. This material has both a specular and a translucent texture which can be used as the subsurface texture. So let's enable both a specular and SSS options and enable them. This one is the specular texture and this one I'm gonna use as the subsurface texture. So now let's go to the mesh paint mode and click on paint. Enable the green channel only and select the plane and start painting. Let's increase the strength. Also make sure that the paint color is black. So the snow texture is too large. Let's set the texture size to 0.15. That's better. Let's decrease the strength and start painting again. I'm gonna set the strength to 0.2. Here's the result. Now, because we enabled SSS for this material, we also have the SSS color parameter down here. So let's enable it, and you can see that if I change it, nothing happens. That's because we should change the property for the material instance. So let's cancel this one, scroll down, under material property overrides, enable shading model, and let's set it to subsurface. Now the snow is already looking better, and also we can change the SSS color and see how it affects the material. The default color is fine most of the time. Let's just decrease the saturation a little bit. We can change this parameter based on the environment and the lighting. Now let's also decrease the normal strength to 0.6. Again, we can add weathering to it or use a custom height texture. I'm gonna use the custom height texture. So let's enable it, enable the parameters. Let's change the texture to Perlin noise. And I'm gonna decrease the size to 0.1, the amount to 0.7, and I'm gonna set the multiplier to 1.2 and the contrast to 1.5. Now here's if I set the custom height texture amount to 0, and here's when I set it to 0.7. It adds some variation to the edges, which looks a little bit better. So let's close this one, enable all the parameters of material 4. Now for this one, I'm gonna use the gray rocks textures. So let's assign them. And I'm gonna set the texture size to 0.12. Let's go over here, click on paint, enable the blue channel, and let's paint it. Again, we can use the height texture parameters to control how it blends with the other layers. So let's set the multiplier to 0.5 and the contrast to 1.5. That's better. Now pay attention that if the mesh is low poly, the vertex painting result may not look so good. So when using vertex painting, make sure your mesh has a decent number of vertices to paint on. So this is how we can use the material and vertex paint on mesh instances. Next, I'm going to show you the workaround to vertex paint on Nanite meshes. Vertex painting on Nanite meshes. First, we should enable Nanite for the mesh. So let's select it, press Ctrl B to find it in the content browser, right click on it and enable Nanite. As soon as we enable it, the vertex color data we painted on it from the mesh paint mode disappears. And if we go closer, we can see the Nanite tessellation and displacement. To vertex paint on Nanite meshes, we should use the modeling mode. So up here, click on selection mode and select the modeling mode. Now under attributes, let's make it wider. We have the paint vertex colors, so let's enable it. And first of all, under visualization, let's set the material mode to original material. This way we see the final result, not the vertex color. Now up here, let's only enable the R channel, set the paint color to black. I'm gonna set the size to 0.15 and let's paint. Here's the result. Let's also paint some snow over here. And the rest of the workflow is the same. After we're finished, we can click on accept, and now we have both vertex color and displacement at the same time. We can see it better here. The caveat is that now the vertex color is not instance based. It's been added into the main static mesh in the content browser. And anytime we add it to our level, let's add it to our level and go to the selection mode, browse to the material and assign it to this mesh. We can see that we get the same result. So it can be really limiting if you're using the mesh multiple times in the level. That's where the new texture painting feature in the 5.5 and above versions come in handy. I'll go over how to use it later in the video. Now before going to the next section, let's remove this one, select it, go back to the modeling mode and select paint vertex colors. I'm gonna erase what we painted earlier. So let's set the size to a higher value, press shift while clicking, enable all the channels and hold shift while click and dragging to remove it. Click on accept and go back to the selection. Actually, let's go back to the modeling mode. Set the material mode to unlit vertex color just to make sure everything is white. So yeah, everything is white. Click on accept. Right click on the mesh in the content browser and disable Nanite. Now we can see that the mesh painting data is back. The height blend parameters. The height blend group consists of parameters that control the height blend contrast between different materials. Let's enable all the parameters. The first one controls the height blend between material 1 and 2. Let's zoom in where the forest ground and the cobblestone are blending in together. Now by default it's set to 1. We can decrease it, for example, to 0 and the contrast decreases, or we can increase it, for example, to 5 and the edges become really sharp. So this is 1, this is 5 and this is 0. 0 is the minimum value we can set for these parameters. It works the same for material 3 and material 4 as well. So for example, let's set the snow contrast to 0 or 0.5, that's better. And let's find material 4. Let's actually paint it. And here's the result for material 4. 1, 4. Let's set it to 1 and continue. Now we can even use it with weathering of each material. In this case we have enabled weathering only for material 1. If we enable it for the other materials, we'll get their parameters here as well. So let's zoom here to see the weathering effect of the cobblestone, and let's increase it one by one. And as you can see, the edges become sharper and sharper. This is when it's set to 0 and this is when it's set to 10. Yeah, let's set it back to its default value of 0.3. The default values work fine most of the time, but I've added these parameters to have more control over the final result. The puddle. Now let's go over how the puddle works, but before that let's remove all the blue paint from the mesh. So select it, go to the mesh paint mode, paint, enable only the blue channel, and let's increase the size of the brush, and I'm gonna hold shift while painting to erase all the blue color. Let's also set the strength to 1. In the material, enable puddle, and as you can see, now we have puddle instead of material 4. So let's enable all its parameters. So now let's go over here. Let's set the size to something lower and also the strength, and make sure that the blue channel is enabled and the paint color is set to black. And let's paint just like the other materials. The puddle also blends based on the height data. That's why we can only see it between the cobblestones. There are ways to change that though. So let's go over its parameters. Tri-planar can be used when the object doesn't have UV set up. We can control the color of the puddle, and the porousness of the surface beneath it. Right now it's 0, so the surface is not porous. When a porous surface becomes wet, its color becomes more saturated and slightly darker. That's what this parameter controls. Now by default the surface is not porous, but if I set it to 1, we can see that the surface beneath it becomes slightly darker and a little more saturated. So let's set it back to 0. The roughness and the opacity parameters can help us make the puddle appear muddy or dirty. Let's first set the wind repel normal strength to 0. Now if I set the roughness to something like 0.4 and the opacity to 0.3, we have a muddy puddle. Let's set both of them back to 0 and we can see just how different they look from each other. Now let's first go over the height parameters and then we'll come back to the ripple parameters. By default, the height of the puddle is set to 5. 5 is the mid value. The height can vary between 0 and 10. So for example, if I set it to 10, we can see that it covers almost everything. And I say almost because if we've overridden the height and displacement of the cobblestone material, the puddle might not cover it. For example, so let's go under material 1 and increase the height texture multiplier to something higher like 5. Now we can see that the puddle is not covering the cobblestone. So if you ever notice that you set the height of the puddle to the maximum value, which is 10, but it doesn't cover the materials, make sure that your height multiplier is not too high. So let's set it back to 2.5 and go back to the puddle parameters. So height of 10 means that it covers everything, 5 is the middle value, and 0 means no puddle. By default, the puddle blends based on the height and the displacement data of the other materials, but we can also add a height texture for the puddle. So for example, here let's search for logo and set it to the Unreal Engine logo texture. I'm gonna zoom out, set it to the selection mode, and I'm gonna increase the height texture multiplier to 10. And as you can see, now we have an Unreal logo shaped puddle in the middle of the mesh. And again, we can use the height parameters to control how much the puddle covers the surface. So let's set it back to the white texture and reset this one to the default multiplier value. So let's increase the height to something like 7 to have more puddle. And let's go over the ripple parameters. We have 4 parameters to control the normal strength, the size, rotation, and the speed of the ripples. So let's set the normal strength to 1, the size to 0.05, the speed also to 0.05. And now if I increase the roughness a little bit, we can see it better. Let's set it to 0.1. And here's the result. So let's set it back to 0 for now. Another feature of the puddle is that if we rotate the mesh, the puddle disappears. So let's select it and let's rotate it like this, and as you can see, it disappears. Let's disable the rotation snap, and here's the result. So as you can see, we can't have it on sloped surfaces. And another parameter we have now is that if we go under height blend parameters, now we have the height blend contrast of the puddle. So let's set it to 0 or 1 or 2. Yeah, 1 is fine. Texture painting. To showcase the texture painting feature, I'm gonna use the 5.5 version of the engine. So let's make a new folder and name it mesh paint _5_5. Move this zip file inside the folder, extract it, and let's open it. There are some things we should consider before using the texture painting feature. First of all, texture painting was added in the 5.5 version of the engine, so we should use the 5.5 version or any version that comes after that. Another thing is that virtual textures should be enabled in your project settings. So from up here, click on settings, go to your project settings, search for virtual textures, and make sure it is enabled. the last thing is that the mesh should have a UV channel that is suited for texture painting. The mesh should be unwrapped and the islands should be packed without any overlap, just like how we unwrap a mesh before sending it into programs such as Substance Painter. The project structure is the same. So let's go to the materials masters folder, create a material instance, name it, and move it to the folder we want. Let's also move this out of the way. Now I'm gonna spend some time and make the same material we created in the other project. We have the puddle, the snow material, the forest ground material, and the cobblestone material. Let's go to the meshes folder. I'm gonna use the low poly plane. Let's bring it into the level, move it into the center of the world, and also move it up a little bit. If I right click on it, we can see that Nanite is enabled. So let's browse the material and assign it to the mesh. Wait a little bit so it prepares the shaders, and now if I zoom in, we can see the Nanite displacement. All the parameters of the material work the same. The only thing we need to do in the material to be able to use texture painting is to expand the global section of the parameters, and here enable this option. We can see that when it's false it uses vertex color, and when it's true it uses texture color. So now let's go to mesh paint mode, and as you can see we have both a vertex color tab and a texture color tab. If you want to use vertex color, you should use this tab, and it works exactly as I showed in the earlier parts of the video. But now we want to use texture color, so click on it. It works a little bit differently. Make sure your mesh is selected and click on the add button here. If the add button is grayed out and you can't click on it, make sure virtual textures is enabled in the project settings. Now clicking on this button adds a virtual texture on the mesh instance we have selected, and we can see that in the details tab under mesh painting. Here it is. Expand the advanced section and enable these two options. We can use overridden mesh paint texture coordinate index to override which UV channel of the mesh should be used for texture painting, and we can use the second one to override the resolution of the mesh paint texture. These two give us per instance control. We can also control them per static mesh. So let's open the static mesh from up here, double click on it to open it. We can see its UV channels from the drop down here, and here if we search for mesh paint, we can see the same two options, only this time we can set it for the static mesh, so we don't have to edit every instance in the level. Now for this video I'm gonna override the values for this specific instance. So the coordinate index of 0 is fine, that's the UV channel I wanna use, but I'm gonna set the texture resolution to 256. The resolution should always be a power of 2. If we set it to other values, say 100, the engine will change it to the closest power of 2 value behind the scenes. In this case it would be 128. So make sure to set it to a power of 2 value and continue. I'm gonna go with 256. So click on the paint to see the paint options, and let's enable only the R channel. Make sure the paint color is white and the erase color is black. Check the brush settings. I'm gonna set the strength to 0.4 and the size is fine. So let's start painting. Another thing we should do after changing the overridden mesh paint texture resolution is to click on the fix button here. So yeah, this makes sure that the resolution is set correctly. Click on the paint button to start painting. So make sure only the R channel or the red channel is enabled. The paint color is white and the erase color is black. Set your brush settings. I'm gonna set the strength to 0.4 and start painting. And as you can see, we have both Nanite displacement and per instance mesh painting. And to show you that it works per instance, let's go to the selection mode, duplicate the mesh, and go back to the mesh paint mode. Now, because we have duplicated the mesh, they're both using the same virtual texture. So to make sure that it works per instance, you should go to the texture color tab, make sure to select the second plane and remove its texture color. Then add another one. Now if I paint on it, for example here, we can see that they work per instance. It's the same mesh. They both have Nanite tessellation and displacement, but the mesh painting data are different. So we have per instance support for Nanite meshes. Now removing and adding a new texture color is necessary. Let's go back to the selection mode and duplicate this mesh. This time I'm not gonna add a new texture color to it. Let's paint on it. And as you can see, this one changes too. That's because they both are using the same texture color. But as soon as I remove the texture color on this one, add a new one and start painting, we can see that now they're different. So let's go back to the selection mode and remove these two. Enable the green channel and let's paint some snow, and also enable the blue channel and paint the puddle. Yeah. So again, if you want to change the texture resolution after adding the texture color, you should always use the fix button. We change the value, for example, to something else like 5.2, and we click on fix and it's updated. And while doing that and setting the texture resolution, keep an eye on the mesh paint texture resource size value up here. Here it is. Higher resolution have more resource size. So right now the resolution is set to 512 and the resource size is 438 kilobytes. And if I set it to 128 and fix it, you can see that it becomes 33. So that's a huge difference. The tri-planar option. Now that we've gone over all of the parameters and also how to vertex paint and texture paint, let's see how and where we can use the tri-planar option. I'm gonna use the tri-planar projection on this model. So let's add it to the level. Move it here and rotate it like this. Let's browse the material we created earlier and assign it to the model. And it looks so bad. That's because the model doesn't have any UV information. So let's name this one underline 1 and duplicate the material. Let's assign this material to the mesh and open it. Now under matte 1, Let's enable tri-planar projection. One of the things about tri-planar projection is that the mesh doesn't need to be unwrapped to be properly textured, and we can obviously see that here. After enabling tri-planar, a couple of things change in the material instance. The default texture size and texture offset parameters disappear, and now we have a tri-planar texture size parameter. Let's enable it. We can use it to change the size of the texture. So for example, if I set it to 2 or 0.5, that's how it works. Also under global, we have two new parameters, tri-planar local space and tri-planar chip. Tri-planar projection has two types, cheap tri-planar and expensive tri-planar. By default, the material uses the cheap version. If we disable the cheap version, it will use the expensive version, and another parameter which is exclusive to the expensive version appears here. I'll go over what it does in a little bit. There are a couple of differences between the cheap and the expensive version. The first one is the number of texture samples. The cheap version has 1 sample per texture, but the expensive version has 3 samples. So when using it with several textures, the cheap tri-planar is really cheaper and has a lot less samplers. For example, matte base has 4 textures. The cheap version has 4 samples, but the expensive version has 3 samples per texture, which means it has 12 samples. So that can be a lot in a material like this where we have 3 or 4 texture sets. Keep that in mind. Let's add a sphere to the level and move it here. Assign the material to it. And let's enable the cheap version. They look a little bit different too. The cheap version has this sharp edge where the projection changes, but let's disable the cheap option. On the expensive one, the different projections smoothly blend into each other, and we can even control that with the transition contrast parameter. By default it's set to 8, let's set it to 4, and we can see that now as we increase it to 8, 10, 15, 20, 30 and 32, the transition becomes sharper. This is how it looks when it's set to 4, and this is how it looks when it's set to 32. This parameter is only available with the expensive version. When we enable the cheap version, it disappears. The next one is the local space option. Right now the textures are being projected in wall space, and when we move or rotate the mesh, we can see that the texture is being projected in the wall and the mesh slides through it. But if we don't want that and we want the texture to stick to the mesh, local space does just that. So let's enable it, and now if I rotate it, the texture is being rotated with it, and if I move it, it moves with it. The texture is attached to the mesh. So we can use these parameters under the global section to control whether tri-planar is local space or wall space, and to control whether it's cheap or expensive. But we have the option to add tri-planar per material. So we can have tri-planar for material 1, but keep it disabled for the other materials. This makes the material more flexible. For now though, let's enable it for material 2. And now we need to use the height parameters to control how they blend. Let's increase it until the material appears. 4 I think is fine. Now as you can see, we have also a parameter to control the tri-planar texture size of the custom mask. So let's set it for example to 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 is good. Yeah. If you see these kinds of areas on your mesh, it's because of the displacement. Now for example, if I go under displacement scaling, it's under material property overrides. Enable displacement scaling and set the magnitude to 0 so we don't have any displacement, and as you can see it's fixed. But if we set it to 4, they appear again. So that's one of the caveats of using displacement and tri-planar on such meshes that don't have UVs. Considerations. Here are some considerations while using the material. If the mesh is low poly and there's no way to add extra vertices to use with vertex painting, consider using texture painting. Make sure to check the compression settings of your textures before using them. For example, the height texture should be set to masks. This is what happens to the puddles if it's set to something else like grayscale. You can check the textures provided with the project to see their compression settings. When we enable tri-planar, there won't be any ripples on the puddle and the wind ripple parameters will also disappear. Most texture sets are ORM or ORDP, but there may be some that are different. In these cases, it's better to export the texture and rearrange the channels in a program like Photoshop. If you want to save time, build better environments, and have flexible materials ready for any Unreal Engine 5 project, check out the download link in the description below. So that's it. Click here for more Unreal stuff, and thank you so much for watching. Massive shout out to my amazing patrons and channel members for making this possible. Like this video, subscribe, and join our communities. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. So, see you in the next one.